One click. That's all it took. One moment, Damian was in his room playing a game. The next, he woke up in a world he thought only existed on his computer. No instructions, no way out, and monsters ready to tear him apart. But with the power of a necromancer, can he survive the monsters, the betrayal, and the war to come? Welcome to the Myth Stories. Let's get into it. Damian had always prided himself on two things: his dedication to fitness and his love for RPGs. Unlike most gamers who stayed indoors, he worked out as his hobby. In games, his characters were swinging swords, running through dungeons, and dodging enemy attacks. These were all things he wanted to be able to replicate in the real world. His latest obsession was Noble's Blade, a niche RPG where players were tasked with saving humanity from the encroaching forces of the Demon Queen. He had sunk countless hours into it, pushing his character through increasingly difficult battles, making careful strategic decisions, and savoring every bit of lore. It was a standard hero's journey: find allies, gain strength, and defeat evil. He had reached about the midpoint of the game when a strange pop-up appeared. Do you wish to take on the real challenge? The prompt seemed out of place. He had never read anything about a special event or hidden mode online. His curiosity got the best of him, and he clicked yes without hesitation. A brilliant light engulfed his screen. He barely had time to register what was happening before a searing force knocked him off his chair. When he opened his eyes, he wasn't in his gaming room anymore. The sky above was a vibrant shade of blue, with sunlight filtering through the thick canopy of a dense forest. The scent of damp earth and fresh leaves filled his nostrils. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his blurred vision, and shakily got to his feet. His legs wobbled beneath him as if he hadn't used them properly in ages. Then the growls came. His blood ran cold as he turned his head. 3 Dustfangs, wolves from Noble's Blade, stood near him. Their glowing crimson eyes locked onto him. Their claws were as strong as steel and sharper than any blade. The beasts were real, and they were hunting him. One lunged at him. Instinct kicked in. He sidestepped and dropped to the ground, rolling away just as the creature's claws slashed through the air where he had been. His hand scrambled for anything nearby and found a fallen branch. Without thinking, he gripped it tightly and swung with all his might. The wood cracked against the Duskfang's skull, shattering into splinters upon impact. The beast collapsed motionless. A ding echoed in his mind. Hidden class Necromancer activated. Suddenly, an unbearable flood of information rushed into his mind. Spells, skills, mechanics, all knowledge of what meant to be a necromancer was forcefully implanted into his consciousness. The sheer overload made his head throb, his vision swimming in and out of focus. Through the pain, he noticed the remaining 2 Duskfangs circling him, baring their fangs. His instincts guided him once again. His hand stretched toward the fallen beast, and black smoke curled from his fingertips, snaking toward the lifeless corpse. The energy seeped into the dead Duskfang, and its body twitched. Its fur lost all color, turning a ghostly gray. Its eyes, once red, now glowed with an airy blue hue. It stood at his side, letting out a deep guttural snarl. The pack hesitated. Something had changed. The once dead Duskfang radiated an aura of unnatural power. Perhaps it was the eerie glow, or maybe it was the shift in presence. But whatever it was, the remaining wolves took a cautious step back before turning tail and vanishing into the underbrush. Damian's breath came in ragged gasps. He had survived, and he wasn't alone. His undead Duskfang turned to him, awaiting his command. A wave of exhilaration coursed through his veins. He wasn't just a player anymore. This was real, and he had just unlocked a class no one had ever heard of before. Damian took a deep breath and looked down at himself. His casual clothes were gone, replaced by a dark, long-sleeved tunic with intricate silver embroidery. A sturdy belt held a small pouch, and his pants were of durable leather, fitted for movement. His boots were well worn but firm. He wasn't just some random traveler. He had been outfitted for adventure. A sudden realization struck him. He needed to understand the full extent of his abilities. Raising the Dustfang had been instinctive, but what else could he do? He focused inward, willing the knowledge he had received to surface. His first ability was Raise Undead, which allowed him to reanimate fallen creatures as his minions. They would retain their original forms but take on an ethereal, spectral quality that marked them as his own. The more mana he possessed, the more undead he could control at once, though for now he was limited to 5. Then there was Soul Reap, a direct attack on an opponent's soul that bypassed all physical defenses. Unlike traditional weapons or magic, it ignored armor and barriers, striking at the very essence of his enemies. The power behind it sent a shiver down his spine. If used correctly, it could be devastating. Finally, he had Death's Embrace, an ability that allowed him to convert his own life force into mana when he ran low. It was a dangerous trade-off, but in desperate situations, it could be the difference between survival and defeat. The more mana he had, the more undead he could control. At his current level, he could raise up to 5 minions. His Dustfang was just the beginning. His heart pounded. If this world followed the mechanics of Noble's Blade, he wasn't just some lost traveler. He had been given a chance to carve his own path in a world he had once only explored through a screen. But he needed information. Where was he? Had anyone else been pulled in? And most importantly, what was his role in all of this? Gripping his makeshift staff, he set off toward the unknown, his undead Duskfang at his side. The real challenge had just begun. After leaving the eerie silence of the forest behind, Damian found himself on a path winding through the wilderness. He had no idea where he was or what lay ahead, but staying in the forest where monsters lurked was not an option. The scent of damp earth and the distant chirping of birds filled the air as he trudged forward, keeping his senses sharp for any signs of danger. Before long, the rhythmic clatter of hooves against the ground caught his attention. A group of armored figures emerged from the tree line ahead, their gleaming silver armor reflecting the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. Knights. Damian barely had a moment to react before one of them, a tall man with a sharp gaze, raised a hand to halt the group. "You there," the knight called, his tone commanding. "Come with us." It wasn't a request. 2 knights dismounted and approached him. Before he could protest, they grabbed him by the arms and lifted him on a horse behind one of them. The knight barely spared him a glance before spurring his mount forward. The ride was long, the hours stretching as the dense forest gave way to rolling fields, and finally towering stone walls loomed in the distance. As they neared the grand city, Damian took in the sight. Massive stone buildings, cobblestone streets bustling with merchants and townsfolk, banners fluttering in the breeze. The city was alive with activity, but the knights paid no mind to the people. They rode with an air of authority, cutting through the streets as if they were above it all. At last, they reached a palace that dwarfed every other building in sight. Gold-etched marble columns framed its entrance, and towering statues of past rulers lined the courtyard. The knights dismounted and ushered Damian inside without a word. The throne room was a spectacle of wealth and power. Marble floors gleamed under flickering chandeliers, intricate banners adorned the high ceilings, and the sheer vastness of the room made Damian feel small. At the far end sat a man on a grand throne, his presence cold and imposing. Beside him sat a woman, elegant yet unreadable, her expression giving nothing away. The knights pushed Damian forward, forcing him to stand before the throne. One of them spoke, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Your Majesty, we have found the summoned one." The king regarded Damian with a scrutinizing gaze, as if expecting to see something remarkable. But when his eyes met Damian's, he merely arched a brow. "You were summoned to this world recently, weren't you?" Damian hesitated, then gave a cautious nod. A slow smile spread across the king's face. "Then you must be the chosen hero." He leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying a rehearsed grandeur. "You were brought to this world to protect humanity. The vile demons have risen from the depths of darkness, seeking to destroy all we hold dear. It is your duty to stand against them and bring salvation to our land." Damian barely had time to process this before the king's gaze sharpened. "Tell me, what class were you granted?" The room seemed to still. Damian swallowed before answering. "Necromancer." A flicker of disgust flashed across his face, gone in an instant, replaced by his practiced smile. "I see." He leaned back in his throne, the warmth in his tone now hollow. "You must be tired from your journey. A servant will escort you to your quarters." A subtle gesture of his hand, and a young servant stepped forward, bowing slightly before motioning for Damian to follow. Though everything in his instincts told him to question, to push back, he held his tongue. He had no say in any of this, not yet anyway. For now he needed information. The room he was given was luxurious, far more extravagant than anything he was used to. A massive bed, silk curtains, gold-trimmed furniture. None of it mattered. He barely had time to take in the details before exhaustion overtook him, and he collapsed onto the bed, sleep claiming him instantly. Morning arrived with a knock at his door. Damian groggily sat up as a servant entered, setting down a tray of food. The smell of freshly baked bread, seasoned meats, and warm broth filled the air. "Eat and prepare yourself," the servant said simply. "Your training begins soon." Then, without another word, the servant left. Damian stared at the tray, confusion still clouding his mind, but he ate nonetheless. Whatever was happening, he needed to be ready. After washing and dressing in the clothes provided, a knight appeared at his door and led him through the palace halls. The clanking of armor accompanied their steps as they made their way outside to a massive training ground. Warriors sparred with swords and spears, while archers practiced their shots against distant targets. A man stood waiting near the center of the grounds. Tall, broad-shouldered, with short silver hair and piercing eyes, he exuded the air of someone who had spent a lifetime on the battlefield. "This is Eldrick," the knight beside Damian announced. "He will oversee your training." Eldrick crossed his arms, studying Damian before giving a small nod. "Come," he said, turning towards a row of horses. "We have much to do." Damian found himself lifted onto another horse, Eldrick taking the reins of his own beside him. As they rode beyond the palace grounds, the veteran warrior explained, "People in this world grow stronger by slaying monsters. The further you travel from the capital, the stronger the beasts become. Your training will prepare you to fight. Once you're strong enough, you'll enter a dungeon. There, you'll gain levels quickly by clearing floors. The ride took them past the city outskirts and into the wilderness, where Damian's training would truly begin. And after I clear the dungeon, Damian asked, already suspecting the answer. Eldric's eyes remained forward, his voice steady. Then you'll be sent to the front lines of the war against the demons. Damian clutched his fists. He had no say in this. Not yet. But one thing was clear. If he wanted to survive, he needed to become strong and fast. And so, Damian's training began. There was no easing into it, no slow adjustment. He was thrown straight into the fire. Every morning he woke to the sound of knocking, barely given time to sit up before breakfast was placed before him. After eating, he was led outside the capital, into the wilds where monsters lurked. There were no instructors guiding his movements, no strategy sessions explaining the best way to fight. Instead, he was given a simple command: survive. He was sent ahead alone, into forests dense with towering trees that hid creatures in their shadows. He was ordered into the ruins of old fortresses, where the remains of past civilizations served as nesting grounds for beasts and undead alike. The knights remained behind, watching from a distance, stepping in only if they deemed the threat too overwhelming. The days built into weeks, then months. The cycle never changed. Fight, rest, fight again. His body aged constantly. His mind teetered between exhaustion and sharp, ruthless determination. But through it all, he grew stronger. Damian fought all manner of creatures in the kingdom's outskirts. Packs of dire wolves, their bodies covered in thick, dark fur, their eyes glowing with an unnatural hunger, lurked between the trees, always testing his reflexes with their speed. He learned early on that overwhelming them with sheer numbers was the best strategy. His undead outnumbered them, dragged them down, and tore them apart before they could close the distance. Then there were the shadow serpents, massive snakes with pitch-black scales that could blend seamlessly into the darkness. They struck with precision, their venom capable of paralyzing weaker prey. Damian relied on his bone cage to block their attacks, striking them down with his minions before they could coil around him. Worse still were the wailing wraiths, spectral entities that haunted the ruins. They could phase through walls, their shrieks capable of disorienting those who heard them for too long. Physical attacks meant nothing to them, but Damian learned that his magic, particularly Soul Reap, could tear through their essence, forcing them into a permanent death. As he adapted to these fews, his power grew. At level 10, something shifted. As he dodged an incoming strike from a massive beast, an unfamiliar sensation flooded his mind, a new power awakening within him, Soul Snare. The moment he willed it into existence, ghostly chains erupted from the ground, wrapping around his enemy and locking it in place. For 5 precious seconds, the creature was utterly immobilized, giving Damian enough time to command his undead to rip into it. Against stronger foes, the skill wouldn't hold them completely, but it slowed them enough to give him an edge. At level 20, he gained Bone Cage, a defensive spell that conjured thick, jagged bones around him like a fortress, blocking both physical and magical attacks to a certain extent. Eventually, the knights took him beyond the capital, on a journey that lasted days. When they finally stopped, Damian found himself standing before the entrance of a dungeon. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and the dark corridors ahead promised only danger. "This will be your hunting ground," Uldric told him. "You'll be staying here for a while. The stronger you become, the more useful you will be." That was all the instruction he was given before the knights set up camp outside. Damian, however, was expected to enter alone. Inside the dungeon, he faced creatures far more terrifying than those outside. The first layer was filled with feral holes, rotting corpses that moved in erratic, unpredictable bursts, attacking with jagged claws and broken teeth. Unlike his own undead, they were mindless, acting only on their hunger. Deeper in, he encountered ironclad guardians, massive suits of enchanted armor that struck with slow, crushing force. They were nearly impervious to normal attacks, forcing Damian to use his minions as bait, maneuvering the guardians into positions where he could unleash Soul Reap or find weaknesses in their joints. The true threats, however, were the bosses. One such creature was the Devourer, a hulking, insectoid monstrosity with 6 limbs, each tipped with serrated claws. Its mouth was lined with writhing tendrils that could latch onto its prey and drain them dry. It forced Damian to rethink his approach, using Soul Snare to lock it down while his undead attacked from multiple angles. The battle had been brutal, but in the end, he triumphed, and was rewarded with his first real treasure. Among the treasures he uncovered, he found a ring of spatial storage, a rare item that allowed him to store belongings without detection. He quickly made use of it, slipping potions and special equipment inside, claiming they had been used or destroyed in battle. Slowly, he began to amass a secret arsenal. One of his first acquisitions was a shadow-woven cloak, a garment that enhanced his movement speed and reduced his presence in darkness. It made it easier to evade enemies and strike unseen. He paired it with ghost-step boots, enchanted footwear that allowed him to move silently, perfect for avoiding unwanted attention. He had also come across a pair of Ebon silk gloves, which granted him a slight increase in overall mana and enhanced his grip, making spellcasting smoother and less likely to drop his items during chaotic fights. Perhaps most valuable of all was the Soulbound Pendant, an eerie amulet that increased his mana regeneration, ensuring he could sustain his summons for longer periods of time. And the knights, they had no idea. They carefully monitored his growth, drip-feeding him resources, ensuring he was only slightly stronger than the monsters he fought. But Damian was always 5 steps ahead. He had been intentionally lying about his level, claiming to be 5 levels lower than he truly was. While they believed him to be at level 25, he had already surpassed level 30. When he finally reached level 30, his necromantic arsenal expanded with Corpse Explosion. The first time he used it, the air cracked with a thunderous boom as the remains of fallen monsters detonated into a fiery inferno. The skill turned the fallen enemies' bodies into explosives, dealing as much damage as their original health points. The skill turned the very battlefield into a weapon, allowing him to chain destruction with each enemy he felled. At level 40, he gained Damage Share, a passive skill that spread all damage he took across his summons. As long as his undead stood, he could absorb devastating blows without suffering the full force of the impact. If his minions fell, then he would take the full hit himself. And then, at level 50, something new emerged, something beyond mere necromantic control. Death Knight. Unlike his other summons, the Death Knight was a presence of its own. Towering clad in dark armor with a massive greatsword resting in its grasp, it radiated an aura of command. It did not simply fight, it led. With it, Damian's control over his undead solidified, turning his minions from mindless fighters into a true army. It strengthened his forces, enhanced his own abilities, and gave him something dangerous: autonomy. The knights had been careful, drip-feeding him power to ensure he remained manageable. But now, Damian wasn't so sure he could be controlled anymore, and soon, they would find that out for themselves. At level 50, Damian decided it was time to face the final boss of the dungeon. He had fought through countless horrors, bested monstrous creatures, and uncovered powerful relics, but this would be his greatest challenge yet. The chamber stretched far beyond what his eyes could see, its vastness swallowed by darkness. Massive stone pillars jutted from the ground, etched with glowing runes that pulsed with a faint red light. The air was thick, suffocating, almost as if the dungeon itself was waiting. And then, it stirred. A low, guttural growl echoed through the chamber, followed by the sound of something massive shifting in the darkness. The ground trembled beneath his feet. Then, from the depths of the chamber, it emerged. A colossal, chimeric horror, towering nearly 30 feet high. Its body was a grotesque fusion of creatures. Muscular limbs resembling those of a titan, jagged, overlapping scales running down its hunched back, and a gaping maw lined with twisted, interlocking teeth. 4 glowing eyes burned like embers on its deformed skull, each fixating on Damian with an unnatural hunger. The creature roared, the sheer force of its voice sending dust and debris cascading from the ceiling. The fight had begun. It moved with terrifying speed despite its size, lunging forward and slamming its massive claws down, barely missing Damian as he rolled to the side. He retaliated instantly, summoning his undead army. 5 skeletal warriors materialized at his command, their weapons raised, followed closely by his newly acquired Death Knight, who stood imposingly at the forefront. The beast unleashed its first ability, Abyssal Howl, a sound so piercing, so filled with raw, primal malice that Damian felt it vibrate through his very soul. His minions faltered, their spectral forms flickering. Had it not been for his passive damage share, he would have collapsed right there, his mind unraveling under the sheer force of it. Then came the second attack, Void Rend. Dark, slashing tendrils erupted from the monster's body, cutting through the air like whips. One struck Damian across the chest, sending him skidding back, the force rattling his bones. His bone cage snapped into place just in time to block a second blow, the spectral walls cracking under the force but holding firm. And then, the worst of them, Endless Spawn. The creature reared back, its 4 eyes glowing ominously, and from the dark recesses of the chamber, hordes of twisted undead emerged. These were unlike any Damian had seen before. Shambling abominations with elongated limbs, clawed fingers twitching with anticipation. They surged forward, shrieking. For hours the battle raged. Damian's minions fell, only to be resummoned. He cycled through spells, using Soul Snare to immobilize the beast for fleeting moments, using Corpse Explosion to chain destruction across the newly summoned monsters. His Death Knight fought tirelessly, blade clashing against the monstrosity's hide, keeping at bay as Damian focused on survival. Wounds accumulated, his mana reserves dwindled, but thanks to his defensive skills and the stolen Soulbound Pendant, his mana replenished just enough to keep fighting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Damian launched one final Soul Reap, a strike that bypassed all physical defenses and struck directly at the essence of the creature. The beast let out a deafening, pained howl. Its massive body trembled. Then, with a final, gurgled growl, it collapsed into a heap of decaying flesh and dust. Damian stood victorious. As he caught his breath, he noticed something at the back of the chamber, a glowing crystal embedded in the stone. Curiosity overtook his exhaustion, and he stepped forward, reaching out to touch it. The moment his fingers grazed the surface, a pulse of energy shot through the air. A hologram flickered to life before him, a woman, stunningly beautiful yet utterly imposing. Her dark feathered wings were folded neatly behind her back, and curved black horns jutted elegantly from her silken, raven-colored hair. Her glowing crimson eyes held an unsettling intensity. Then she spoke. Her voice was smooth, yet airily devoid of emotion. Things aren't as they seem. If you've made it to this point, you should have noticed the way they treat you. Find the truth on your own, and when you're ready, come to the front. We'll talk then. And just as suddenly as it appeared, the hologram vanished. The crystal lost its glow, turning dull before cracking apart into dust. A heavy silence settled over the chamber, but Damian had no time to dwell on what he had just witnessed. He quickly searched the room for any remaining valuables. In a heavy stone chest, he found an obsidian belt enchanted to increase stamina and reinforce his core strength. Beside it lay a crimson potion radiating an aura of condensed power. A single sip granted a temporary surge in mana regeneration and spell potency, though the effects only lasted for a short duration. He stored away what he found useful, placing them inside his ring. The rest, trinkets of little importance, were turned over to the knights, masked as useless junk. The next day, the group departed from the dungeon, making their way back to the palace. The moment they arrived, Damian was given no time to rest. He was summoned before without delay. Seated on his grand throne, the king regarded him with an almost theatrical air of grandeur, speaking in dramatic tones. "We need not wait any longer," the king announced. "You have proven your worth. In 2 days you will march to the front lines. There you shall join the war against the vile demons and secure humanity's future." Damian merely nodded, showing no outward reaction. He followed the servant back to his chambers, but something gnawed at him. He was being watched constantly. Any attempt to explore would be difficult. That night, he donned his newly acquired equipment: the shadow-woven cloak, ghost-step boots, and obsidian belt. Silently, he slipped through the halls, trying to listen for anything of interest. Unfortunately, he found nothing of value. While avoiding a patrolling guard, however, he stumbled into a library. And calling forth his rabbit familiar, he whispered, "Find an air current where there shouldn't be one." Minutes later, his rabbit led him to a section of bookshelves. They appeared normal, but upon closer inspection, he spotted a thin crack along the frame. After almost an hour of trying to find the hidden mechanism to open the secret door without any luck, he grew frustrated. He was about to just kick the thing down when his foot stopped in midair. A thought struck him. He was a necromancer. Summoning his goblin minion on the opposite side, he simply commanded, "Push." The bookshelf swung open, revealing a hidden room. Inside were scrolls, tomes, and books that lined the walls. Damian sifted through them, piecing together fragments of information. What he found changed everything. Long ago, demons and humans had lived in harmony. But when humans discovered the demons' innate superiority in magic, fear took root. Under the guise of securing humanity's survival, they waged war. Not for defense, but for conquest. They enslaved demons, using their powers as a resource, branding them as enemies to justify their oppression. As he turned another page, the first rays of sunlight began creeping through the windows. Damn it. Rushing to put everything back in place, he hurried to his room. Just as he jumped through the window, a knock came at the door. His heart pounded. He barely had time to throw himself into bed, pulling the blanket over his equipment-clad body just as the door creaked open. A servant entered, their disapproving eyes sweeping over him, still laying in bed so late. Seeing him still asleep, they sighed in annoyance before leaving. The rest of the day and the one after were spent in deep thought. Damian wanted to speak with the Demon Queen, but how would he get her attention? There was only one thing he could think of. It would be a Hail Mary play, but it was all he had at the moment. And so, when his final meal in the palace was granted, Damian silently prepared himself. He was going to the battlefield, but not to fight for humanity. He needed to find the Demon Queen. After a grueling month and a half of travel, Damian finally arrived at the battlefield's front lines. The moment he took in the scene before him, a cold sweat broke out on his face. It was pure devastation. Both human and demon bodies littered the ground, limbs twisted unnaturally, lifeless eyes staring up at the smoke-filled sky. The sheer amount of blood had turned the once solid earth into a dark, clinging swamp of crimson and mud. The battle had clearly raged on for years, neither side yielding, their forces ground down to the bone. And yet, despite the exhaustion written on every fighter's face, the conflict showed no signs of stopping. Damian's brows furrowed as he observed the slaughter, his gut churning with unease. This war was pointless. All these lives lost. Nothing but pawns sacrificed on a board ruled by greedy, arrogant men. It was the same cycle, over and over, just with new faces wearing the crowns and wielding power. He let out a slow breath, resigning himself to the reality before him. He would resolve this no matter what it took. His gaze swept across the battlefield, searching, until he found his target, a demon general commanding troops from an elevated position, overseeing the slaughter below. Damian didn't hesitate. This was his way in. With a silent command, he summoned his fastest minions, the air distorting as they emerged. Cloaked in spectral energy, the undead forces surged forward. Shove them aside. Don't kill them unless necessary. The order was absolute. His minions moved with unnatural coordination, parting the battlefield like an unstoppable tide. Humans and demons alike were flung aside, not injured, just displaced. In the chaos of war, few even noticed what was happening. Slipping through the carnage, Damian activated his ring of spatial storage, retrieving the equipment he had hidden away. His shadow-woven cloak settled around his shoulders, dampening his presence. His ghost-step boots allowed him to weave through the battlefield soundlessly, making him a blur amidst the chaos. Even with the enhancements, his approach wasn't entirely smooth. Several times he found himself surrounded or intercepted, demons and knights alike unwilling to let him pass. But Damian was relentless. With each block in his path, he forced his way through, using precision, not brute force. By the time he broke through the heart of enemy territory, he stood face to face with the demon general. The imposing figure loomed over him, clad in dark, jagged armor, crimson eyes gleaming like embers beneath his helm. And yet, instead of raising weapons, Damian slowly raised his hands in surrender. "I come with a message," he declared. "The demon queen wants to speak with me." For a moment, the general simply stared at him, caught between surprise and amusement. Then, laughter, a deep, guttural, mocking sound. The general threw his head back, shaking with mirth as if Damian had just told the funniest joke in the world. "A you," the general sneered. "A human claiming an audience with Her Majesty. What arrogance." But after a moment the general's laughter died down and a spark of intrigue flickered in his eyes. "Very well," he mused. "I'll give you a chance, human. Defeat our champion, and I'll let you send one message." Damian exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temple. So much for making this easy. The champion stepped forward, a towering behemoth of a demon, muscles packed like steel cords beneath thick, plated armor. He carried a massive, two-handed axe, its edge gleaming with enchantments that pulsed with lethal energy. His presence alone was to make lesser warriors tremble. But Damian had no intention of dragging this out. The champion clearly underestimated him. Perhaps because of his size, or because he was human, or because the general had been laughing at him moments prior. It didn't matter. That arrogance would be his downfall. Damian's eyes darkened as his mana surged. All 50 of his minions erupted forth at once. A tide of death swarmed the champion from every direction, skeletal warriors and wraiths striking in perfect synchronization. At the same time, soul snare, phantom chains shot up from the ground, wrapping around the champions like iron vices. His movements halted, completely immobilized. His expression twisted into confusion, then panic, and then came the execution. Absol reap a concentrated strike at the very essence of his being, a direct attack on his soul itself. Damian layered the attacks, relentless, merciless, each strike compounded by the combined assault of his minions. There was no room to react, no chance to recover. By the time the champion understood the reality of the situation, it was already over. With one final crack, his soul shattered, his body collapsed lifeless onto the blood-soaked earth. The battlefield fell silent. Damian turned back to the general, brushing dust off his sleeve as if the fight had been nothing more than an inconvenience. He tilted his head, arching an eyebrow. "Ready for the message." The general stood frozen, his expression completely dumbfounded. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly agape. Whatever amusement he had before was long gone. After a few seconds, he managed a slow, stiff nod. Wordlessly, Damian delivered his message, his voice calm and unwavering. "Let's talk." There was no embellishment, no unnecessary words, just those two simple ones. The general hesitated for a long moment before finally stepping away. Within seconds, he returned, his face unreadable. "There's a carriage waiting," he said gruffly. "She will see you." Damian nodded, exhaling. Step 1 was complete. Now, it was time to meet the Demon Queen. The carriage ride from the battlefield to the Demon Queen took about a month. Unlike human carriages, which were limited by the endurance of horses, the demon transport moved at incredible speeds, likely enhanced by advanced magic that optimized efficiency. As Damian traveled deeper into demon territory, he braced himself for the dark and ominous atmosphere he had always heard about. Shrouded lands filled with twisted trees, oppressive silence, and eerie shadows. Instead, what he saw stole his breath away. The dense, lifeless forests near the battlefield gradually gave way to lush, vibrant landscapes unlike anything he had seen before. Towering trees with crimson gold and sapphire blue leaves stretched toward the sky, their foliage shifting colors when the light touched them. Vines thick with bioluminescent flowers curled around massive trunks, glowing softly in hues of violet and teal, lighting the pathways even in the darkest hours. The air smelled rich with earth, flowers, and the crisp scent of magic. Damian passed rolling fields of shimmering grass, each blade reflecting the sunlight like tiny gemstones. Crystal-clear rivers snake through the countryside, their waters running in soft gradients of silver and azure as if infused with raw mana. When the first village came into view, Damian almost did a double take. Instead of war-torn ruins or fearsome, battle-hardened demons, he saw families. Demon children ran through the streets, their laughter echoing as they played games. Vendors stood at open-air stalls, selling exotic-looking fruits and woven fabrics, haggling in lively conversation with customers. The scent of freshly baked bread and roasted meat filled the air, carried by a warm, welcoming breeze. The villages continued thriving, lively, and peaceful. As they neared the capital, the landscape shifted once again. Instead of small villages, majestic spires and massive towers began to rise in the distance. Soon the walls of the demon capital loomed into view, and Damian couldn't stop himself from staring. The city was breathtaking, a harmonious blend of ancient elegance and magical innovation. The capital sprawled across the horizon in a mesmerizing display of architecture. Buildings were carved from obsidian and white marble, their surfaces etched with glowing runes that pulsed with soft light at regular intervals. Floating lanterns drifted lazily through the air, casting a warm glow over the streets below. Bridges of translucent crystal spanned across rivers and canals, humming faintly as magic reinforced their structure. The streets were clean and filled with life. Merchants sold their wares under elegant canopies. Musicians played in the town squares, and noble demons clad in fine silks and adorned with intricate jewelry moved gracefully through the city. Damian had seen many human cities before, but this was something else entirely. And then, finally, the palace. If the capital was a masterpiece, the Demon Queen's palace was a vision straight out of legend. The enormous structure towered over the rest of the city, constructed from a blend of black onyx, silver veined marble, and enchanted crystal. The exterior shimmered faintly as if it were absorbing and reflecting the energy around it, giving the entire palace an almost otherworldly aura. At its entrance, 2 massive obsidian gates stood, engraved with depictions of majestic winged figures and fierce battle scenes, glowing faintly with protective enchantments. The towering spires of the palace stretched impossibly high into the sky, their tips crowned with floating orbs of violet energy, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. Damian barely had time to process the sight before the carriage slowed to a stop. As he stepped out, he was immediately met with the wary gazes of palace guards. Unlike the soldiers on the battlefield, these guards were finely armored, wearing dark, polished metal adorned with intricate etchings of their respective houses, their weapons pulsed with dormant magic, crackling faintly in the air. They stared at him, their expressions ranging from suspicion to sheer confusion. A human. Here. One of the carriage's demon soldiers stepped forward, his voice firm. He has an audience with the queen. The guard's eyes widened, and for a moment, stunned silence fell over the group. It was clear they had not been expecting that. But the moment of shock passed quickly. They stiffened, nodded, and motioned for Damian to follow. Escorted through the palace halls, Damian took in his surroundings. The interior of the palace was just as breathtaking as the outside. The floors were made of enchanted obsidian, polished so smoothly it reflected the ceilings above like a mirror. Massive chandeliers of floating star-like crystals illuminated the halls, casting a soft, celestial glow. Banners woven from midnight silk hung along the walls, embroidered with golden thread depicting the Demon Queen's crest. Everywhere he looked, there was an air of elegance and power. Finally, they reached a set of colossal double doors, carved from an unknown dark wood, inlaid with silver and violet gemstones. The guards pushed them open, and Damian stilled. The throne room was vast, lined with towering obsidian pillars, and at the end of the grand hall, sitting upon an intricate, high-backed throne, was the Demon Queen. For the first time since arriving, Damian found himself momentarily speechless. She was beyond beautiful. Her presence was almost unreal, as if the very air around her had bent to accommodate her existence. Long flowing dark hair cascaded down her body, shifting like liquid silk, pooling elegantly around her. Her piercing violet eyes glowed with intelligence, her delicate lips curled into an unreadable smirk. Her gown was a regal masterpiece, woven from fabrics so fine they seemed almost ethereal, adorned with gemstones that shimmered like captured stardust. Everything about her was perfect, flawless, and for a split second, Damian forgot to breathe. Snapping himself out of it, he strode forward and bowed deeply, his movements precise and respectful. The queen watched him, amusement flickering in her gaze. A slow, knowing smirk played on her lips as she finally spoke. "Welcome to the Demon Lands," she said smoothly. Then, after a brief pause, she continued him, "Celestra, Queen of the Demons." Her smirk deepened and she asked, "Not quite what you expected, is it?" Damian stared directly into her eyes, his own unwavering as he responded without hesitation. "No," he said honestly, his voice steady. "It is absolutely gorgeous. I am Damian, the summoned necromancer." A flicker of surprise flashed across the queen's face. Not many people had looked her directly in the eyes when they spoke to her before. The surprise was there for only a second, gone before most would have noticed. But Damian did. She quickly recovered, clearing her throat lightly before shifting back into composed authority. Celestra rose gracefully from her throne. "Come," she said, turning toward a side door. "There is something I want you to see first." She took him through an ornate hallway and into a vast, ancient library. The walls stretched high, packed with endless rows of bookshelves, some lined with scrolls, others with glowing tomes bound in leather and metal. A massive crystal chandelier hung above, casting a soft light throughout the room. "This," Celestra said, motioning toward the library, "is where our history is recorded. See for yourself how things truly happened." She took a seat on one of the elegant chairs and gestured for Damian to explore freely. Just as he stepped toward a shelf, his stomach grumbled. Damian paused, giving Celestra an awkward look. For the first time, true surprise flickered across her face. Then, to his astonishment, she let out a soft, adorable giggle. "You humans are truly something else," she mused before calling over a servant. "Bring some food," she instructed. Damian gave a brief nod. "Thanks." Then, while the food was being prepared, he turned back to the shelves, grabbing a pile of books and setting them down at the nearest table. As he read, he didn't notice Celestra watching him. She was trying to decipher if he was truly trustworthy, or just playing a dangerous game. After a while, the food arrived. Damian sincerely thanked the servant, who looked stunned that a human would thank a demon. The servant hesitated, then bowed respectfully before leaving. Damian, unaware of the reaction, continued reading while eating. Finally, after finishing both the food and the book, he looked to Celestra and nodded slowly. "Everything matches what I found in the king's palace," he murmured. "It seems those greedy idiots have been ruining this land and its people for quite a while now. It's about time we put an end to this." Celestra, taken aback by how easily he dismissed his fellow humans, was momentarily at a loss for words. She eventually caught herself and nodded. "For now, you must be tired. Get some rest. We will discuss plans tomorrow." For the first time, Damian felt like he was being guided, not monitored, and that was a refreshing feeling. Damian plopped onto the bed, exhaling deeply as his body sank into the soft mattress. For the first time since he arrived in this world, he felt somewhat relaxed. He let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head at the irony of it all. More relaxed among demons than he ever was among humans. If someone had told him a month ago that he'd be sitting in a demon queen's palace, working with them to end a war instead of fighting in one, he would have called them insane. But here he was. And with that fleeting moment of peace came sleep, deep, dreamless, and untroubled. For the first time in what felt like forever, he slept soundly. The morning sun peeked through the sheer curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. Slowly, Damian stirred, blinking as his mind groggily drifted toward wakefulness. That's when he saw her, sitting at the edge of his bed, hands resting neatly on her lap. Celestra. His half-asleep brain barely processed the sight before panic set in. "Gah!" He jerked upright, letting out a yell that was way too loud for this early in the morning. Celestra, caught off guard, jumped as well, her wings fluttering slightly. "What in the Damian?" She shot him an annoyed glare. "Am I really that terrifying to look at?" Damian blinked, his heartbeat still racing. "No! I mean, who just sits next to someone's bed while they're sleeping? What if I drooled or snored?" Celestra rolled her eyes. "I had something important to discuss, and I wasn't exactly staring at you the entire time, if that's what you're implying." "Still weird," Damian muttered, rubbing the sleep from his face. "You ever hear of knocking? Or, I don't know, waiting in the next room like a normal person? You're in my palace." She shot back. "I can wait wherever I please." "Wow, royalty privilege. I see how it is." And just let the banter began, flowing so naturally that it was as if they had known each other since childhood. Back and forth they went. Sarcasm, playful jabs, amused smirks. Celestra found herself laughing under her breath. This was new. Someone speaking to her so freely, without layers of formality, without trying to impress her, without carefully chosen words designed to curry favor or avoid offense. No hidden agendas, no careful calculations, just conversation. Something about it was refreshing. Something about it was dangerously comfortable. Realizing they were getting too carried away, she held up both hands, signaling for him to stop. Then, closing her eyes, she took in a deep breath before exhaling slowly. "Enough! Get washed up. We have a lot to discuss." And with that, she turned on her heel and swiftly left the room. Her face burned. As she walked down the hall, she pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the rapid beating of her heart. Strange. She had never interacted with anyone like this before. With nobles, with Worry One. She always had to be careful, measured, always reading between the lines, always analyzing. But with Damian, there was nothing to analyze. No strategy, no hidden meaning, just words, just him. And despite herself, she found she quite liked it. After Damian had properly washed up and dressed, Celestra took him to breakfast. It was a quiet meal, but not awkward. A comfortable silence stretched between them as they ate, the only sounds being the occasional clinking of utensils and murmured conversations from the other palace attendants. Once finished, she led him through the winding halls of the palace, the soft glow of enchanted lanterns guiding their way until they arrived at the war room. Damian had expected a room filled with grizzled, battle-worn warriors. What he saw instead were nobles, high-ranking demons, ministers, strategists. And the moment he stepped inside, the air changed. Conversations halted. Eyes snapped to him, their expressions ranging from shock to suspicion. Murmurs rose like a brewing storm, some whispering amongst themselves, others staring at Celestra in silent demand for an explanation. Why was a human here? Why was he in their most secretive war room? Damian could feel the tension rising. Before anyone could open their mouths to question, Celestra spoke first as Damian. Her voice rang with power, commanding unwavering absolute. He is the summoned one, the only one who has seen the true history of this world. He is not our enemy. He is here to help us end this war. More murmurs, some skeptical, some curious. A noble stepped forward, brows furrowed, as if preparing to voice opposition, but before a single word could be uttered, Celestra's aura shifted. Her power, her authority as queen, crashed through the room like a wave. It wasn't magic. It wasn't attack. It was presence. A silent but undeniable force that demanded obedience. A ruler did not ask for acceptance. She commanded it, and in an instant, just like that, the murmuring ceased. The nobles straightened. No more whispers, no more questioning glances. Damian, standing beside her, felt the weight of it. He had seen so many sides of Celestra. The teasing one, the amused one, the soft one. But this was the first time he had seen her as a ruler. And, for a split second, it caught him off guard. He quickly shook it off, turning his attention to the large map in the center of the war table. Damian's eyes flickered across the map in the war room, absorbing the details of the human kingdom's fortifications. The gathered demon nobles still regarded him with skepticism, but Celestra's presence kept them silent. He took a deep breath before placing his finger on the capital. "There's only one real way to end this war," he said, his tone even and unwavering. "We need to capture the king and expose the truth. But we can't just march an army into the capital. If we do, it'll only strengthen their propaganda against you. Instead, we have to be precise, silent, and make sure that when the truth comes out, the people themselves demand change." The room was silent for a moment before Celestra leaned forward, a glint of intrigue in her crimson eyes. "And how do you propose we do that?" Damian smirked. "By using their own system against them." The war room had fallen quiet after Damian's plan was set in motion. Now came the hardest part: preparation. The necessary materials needed to be gathered, specialists needed to be chosen, and every detail had to be perfected. It would take time, and while Celestra's trusted nobles and generals worked in the shadows to secure what they needed, she found herself with an unusual amount of free time. And so, she made a decision. "You've seen the truth of our history," she said to Damian as they stood on the palace balcony, the sprawling city below them. "But now, you need to see the truth of our present." She turned to him, her crimson eyes catching the sunlight. "Come with me." Damian followed Celestra through the city streets, and for the first time, he truly saw the demon lands, not as an enemy, not as an outsider looking in, but as someone standing within it. The capital was alive. It wasn't the war-torn, blood-drenched land that human rulers spoke of. The streets were bustling, filled with merchants calling out their wares, children weaving between the legs of armored warriors, laughter echoing through the air. The buildings, crafted from dark stone, were covered in intricate carvings. Stories of heroes, of battles, of victories and defeats. Some demons had wings, others horns, some had additional arms or tails, but they all lived like any other people. Damian had spent so long hearing about the monsters of the demon lands, and yet, everywhere he looked, all he saw were people. A group of children ran past them, chasing a small, floating wisp of fire that flickered like a playful spirit. One of them, a tiny horned girl, tripped on the cobblestone, her little wings flapping uselessly as she braced for impact. Before she could hit the ground, Damian caught her. "Careful there," he said, setting her back on her feet. She blinked up at him, her wide golden eyes full of curiosity. "You're a human," she gasped. Damian chuckled. "I was last I checked." The other children gathered around, whispering excitedly. "A human. Here." And he didn't seem mean at all. Celestra stood a few steps back, watching. She expected Damian to brush the children off, to keep his distance as most humans would. Instead, he crouched down to their level, letting them bombard him with questions. "Do you really eat with weird little sticks? Can humans breathe fire? Why do your ears look like that? Are you really helping the queen?" He laughed, ruffling the hair of the boldest one who had come right up to him. "One question at a time, guys. And no, I can't breathe fire. Wish I could, though." Celestra found herself smiling. Damian blended in so easily, without hesitation, without fear. He treated them as if they weren't demons at all, but simply people. And in return they accepted him instantly. As they continued walking, the more they explored, the more Damian helped wherever he could. When an elderly vendor struggled to carry a crate of fruit, Damian lifted it without a second thought, waving off their thanks. When he saw a group of young warriors sparring in an open courtyard, he stepped in, offering pointers on footwork and dodging that he had picked up in his time fighting monsters. When a little demon girl scraped her knee, he knelt and gently wrapped the wound in a strip of cloth, telling her she was very brave. Celestra simply watched. By the time evening arrived, they sat together at a small outdoor eatery, watching as the city lights flickered to life. The air was filled with the smell of roasting meat and spiced wine. Celestra hadn't realized how much time had passed. Her people had embraced him in a way she hadn't expected, and Damian had embraced them just as much. As she sipped her drink, she found herself studying him, the way his dark eyes shone with curiosity as he listened to the tavern owner's story, the way he laughed, genuinely laughed, when an old demon warrior told a wild tale of battle, the way he had spent the entire day interacting with her people as if he belonged. It was strange. She was a queen. People had always served her, respected her, feared her. But Damian, he just talked to her, bantered with her, challenged her. She had thought she needed to test his trustworthiness. Instead, she found herself trusting him more than she expected. And that realization was terrifying. She looked away, feeling an unfamiliar warmth creeping up her neck. On the other side of the table, Damian was having his own realizations. Celestra wasn't like the nobles he had met before. She didn't carry herself with arrogance, didn't treat her people as pawns. She watched, cared. She had given him the freedom to explore, had let him see her people for what they really were, and in doing so, had shown him who she was. He glanced at her, catching the way she tucked a loose strand of jet black hair behind her ear, the soft flicker of golden lanterns reflecting in her fiery red eyes. He had to admit, she was beautiful. But it wasn't just that. For the first time since coming to this world, Damian felt like he wasn't alone. That night, as they walked back toward the palace, neither of them spoke for a long while. But the silence wasn't awkward. It was comfortable. Finally, Damian stretched, looking up at the sky. "All right," he said. "Now I get it." Celestra raised an eyebrow. "Get what?" He smirked, stuffing his hands into his pockets. "Why you fight so hard for this place?" He glanced at her, his expression softer than before. "Worth protecting." Celestra felt her heart skip a beat. She turned her gaze forward, hiding the small smile tugging at her lips. "Of course it is," she said, voice quieter than usual. The city lights shone behind them as they walked. Tomorrow, they would begin the real mission. But tonight, something else had begun. The next day, Damian awoke early, his mind razor-sharp with focus. The time had come to put an end to this war, not with swords, but with precision and strategy. The human capital was an impenetrable fortress, its towering walls and endless patrols designed to keep enemies out. But what the humans hadn't known, Damian had uncovered. An escape tunnel, long buried in the annals of history. Built centuries ago beneath the palace, it was meant as a last resort for the royal family in times of crisis. Now it would serve a far different purpose. Under the cover of night, Damian led his strike force, a perfect blend of deception and lethality. His fastest undead, dressed in scavenged human armor, moved like living soldiers, their unnatural grace disguised by disciplined control. Alongside them, Celestra's most elite assassins mented into the darkness, their presence as silent as death itself. Approaching the city gates, they assumed the guise of a returning patrol. The flickering torchlight revealed a dozen wary human sentries, their expressions bored and inattentive. A simple nod from Damian, and his undead mimicked the casual exhaustion of soldiers returning from a long journey. The guards barely spared them a glance before waving them through. Once inside, the assassins dispersed, vanishing into alleyways like wraiths. Damian's mind raced, mapping every route, every patrol. The palace loomed ahead, its spires gleaming under the moonlight. They had one chance. Failure meant death, but success meant the war's end. Navigating the palace corridors was surprisingly easy. The undead guards stationed along pre-planned routes replaced the living ones in seamless transitions, slipping into their roles without a sound. Their former counterparts never had a chance, subdued before they even realized the danger. The palace itself was a monument to decadence. Gilded halls, lavish tapestries, towering columns adorned with wealth stolen from the suffering. Damian felt the weight of the place, a testament to a ruler who had grown complacent in his unchecked power. The king's chamber doors were imposing, reinforced with layers of magic meant to ward off assassins. But these defenses had one flaw. They were meant to repel the living, not the dead. Damian extended his hand, tendrils of shadowy energy snaking through the seals, unraveling them silently. With a mere gesture, his undead surged forward. The human guards within the chamber barely had time to reach for their weapons before they were overwhelmed, silent hands clamping over their mouths, dragging them down into darkness. The assassins followed, making quick work of any lingering resistance. And then at the center of the grand chamber stood King Aldrich. He barely had time to react before Damian unleashed Soul Reap. The very air around the king darkened as a spectral force latched onto him, draining his strength, sapping his will. The once imposing ruler collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, his golden robes now nothing more than a hollow symbol of his authority. Damian stepped forward, his devoid of emotion. "You're coming with us." Back in the demon capital, Aldrich sat bound in a heavily warded chamber, his regal attire now disheveled, his arrogance eroded by the weight of his circumstances. Yet, even as he sneered at his captors, his defiance remained. "You think my people will believe anything you say? They'll assume this is all a demon trick." Damian merely chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "That's why we'll make you say it." He raised a hand, and instantly, the room darkened. A bitter chill seeped into the air as whispers, low, mournful, angry, began to swirl around them. The torches flickered wildly, and thing they appeared, the souls of the dead. Spectral figures took shape, their faces twisted in pain, their voices filled with sorrow and rage. Soldiers who had perished on the battlefield, innocents caught in the crossfire, families torn apart by a war that had never been necessary. Their gazes locked onto the king, hollow and accusing. Aldrich's sneer faltered. His breathing grew rag, his pupils dilating in sheer horror. Damian stepped closer, his tone dangerously soft. "These are the voices of the people you condemned, the ones whose deaths you orchestrated for wealth, power, and pride. Now you will tell the world the truth, or they will haunt you for eternity." The king's lips trembled, his sweat-drenched face palling with every anguished cry that reached his ears. His bravado crumbled under the weight of thousands of lost souls demanding justice. By the time Celestry's spies escorted him to the royal communication chamber, he was a broken man. After the king disappeared from the room, the specters removed their masks and cloaks, revealing the demon soldiers underneath, grinning mischievously. "I can't believe that actually worked," one said while trying not to burst into laughter. Another simply nodded as they covered their mouths, snickering. The magical broadcast relay connected to every major city in the human kingdom, a powerful tool designed for royal decrees. Tonight, it would be used for something far different. The people gathered, expecting another speech glorifying the war. Instead, they received a confession. With his voice shaking, Aldrich spoke. He detailed the lies, the fabricated conflicts, the hidden deals made in shadows. He revealed how he had prolonged the war for profit, how he had manipulated resources, how he had sent thousands to their deaths not out of necessity, but greed. The kingdom fell into silence as the truth echoed through its streets. Across the land, the reactions were immediate. Civilians stood frozen, their eyes wide in disbelief. Murmurs turned into shouts, and then into outrage. The streets of the capital erupted in protest, anger washing over the people like wildfire. Nobles scrambled to control the damage, but it was too late. The foundation of the kingdom had cracked. Damian watched from a distance, standing beside Celestra on a high balcony overlooking the demon capital. He could already see the ripple effect spreading beyond the human borders. Celestra folded her arms, amusement dancing in her crimson eyes. "I must admit that was impressive." Damian exhaled slowly, allowing himself the smallest of smiles. War was never about demons versus humans. It was about power, and now that the people know the truth, they'll decide what comes next. Below, the kingdom burned, not from fire and steel, but from revolution. And for the first time since arriving in this world, Damian felt it. The war was over, not with bloodshed, but with truth. Now, he looked forward to this world rising from the blood-soaked ashes into a beautiful and prosperous one. He would, of course, help with this, as it will take time and cooperation from both sides. If you enjoyed the story, why not drop a like and maybe consider subscribing? I plan to upload new and unique stories several times a week.